Martin Pistorius was born in 1975 in Johannesburg, Republic of the South Africa. The first 13 years of Martin's life didn't stand out for anything special. He was an ordinary, healthy, happy child. He loved everything which was connected with electricity and electronics. From the age of 11, he fixed the sockets at home. At the same age, he created an alarm system so that his younger brother and sister David and Kim couldn't get into his room without his permission. Martin also loved Lego and his little ginger dog Packy. Martin dreamed of becoming an electric man, something like a comic book hero, able to control electricity. In January 1988, Martin returned home from school with a severe sore throat that worsened his day path. At first, the boy was diagnosed with cryptococcal meningitis, but the treatment didn't help. The pain intensified, it was difficult for him to speak, and then things began to happen which couldn't be associated with meningitis. Weeks passed and Martin's condition worsened. He completely stopped eating, constantly slept in his room. It was painful for him to move. He began to change in consciousness. Every month his memory weakened along with his body. At first, Martin began to forget various seemingly unnecessary trifles, but after months, memory impairments took on large-scale frightening consequences. Martin began to forget the names and faces of his acquaintances, and then he began to forget his family and even himself. Joan, Martin's mother, played him a video with Martin's father Rodney every day when he left for work. She hoped that when Rodney returned home, Martin would remember his father. She showed him pictures of the family, repeated the names every day. Mother wanted to stop the elusive memory by repeating the information over and over again, but it was useless. Doctors couldn't make a diagnosis. No one had ever experienced such things. Endless consultations, trips to different hospitals, meetings with doctors and professors, x-rays, electrocardiograms, magnetic resonance studies, blood tests, new drugs didn't bring any results. The family tried everything: healers, decoctions of rare herbs, expensive vitamin courses. A year later, Martin, lying in a hospital bed, said the last words.
"When are we going home?"
He already couldn't speak any longer. Martin's limbs were twisted over time. The child was rapidly losing weight, didn't react to anything, but his body continued to live. He seemed to be in a waking coma. His father set an alarm and turned his son every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. Parents washed, dressed, fed Martin according to the schedule every day. He could eat from a spoon and drink from a straw. Looking at one point, he did it instinctively. There was no awareness in his actions, and the doctors suspected some kind of neurodegenerative disease, but this case remained a medical mystery for them. They told Joan and Rodney that their son is in a vegetative state. In other words, he is a vegetable. He doesn't understand anything and doesn't feel anything. The mind has long since left the body. The doctors advised the parents to send Martin to a boarding school. Parents weren't ready to accept such advice. Joan left work and was at home with her son all the time. Rodney was now constantly working. He often returned home when David and Kim were already sleeping. A year later, Martin's parents decided to send Martin to a temporary hospital, but every evening, without exception, they took their son home. Martin really wasn't present in his body for the last year. He was like an empty cocoon. His consciousness hovered somewhere. When Martin turned 16, for some reason his consciousness decided to return. It was an amazing case. At first, it happened in flashes. Everything was like a fog, as if the mind was gradually rebooting. Martin remembered something, but mostly he was in oblivion. One of his most vivid memories of that period was this. It was his 16th birthday. Martin heard his relatives discussing whether to shave off his rare stubble. Such conversations frightened Martin. He felt like a child of 12 years old and, as he thought, he didn't have any bristles. A few years fell out of his life, another flash and now another day, other people. and he in another room, everything looked like a slideshow. It was strange, but not frightening. The fear came later. Finally, the mind returned to Martin when he was 19 years old. Now he was aware of everything, felt and understood. The memory never left him again. It was at that age that Martin, now in his body, constantly comprehended the terrible truth. In his body, he seemed to be buried alive. He couldn't move and couldn't tell anyone that he was back. Previously, he was treated like a potted plant that needed care, and to some extent he was, but now he is a man locked inside. No one noticed that he came back again. Now he is in a present time. Martin began to think about how to signal the family. Once, on a typical evening for Rodney, he bathed his son as always, but that evening was unusual for Martin because for the first time he understood everything, felt every touch during his bath. Martin struggled to give his father a sign with his hand, but the hand didn't move. Martin was concentrated on his own hand. He begged, ordered hand to make a move and got angry, but it remained motionless, and the father suddenly asked,
"Are you all right, son?"
and looked into the eyes of his son, but silence followed. Martin, looking at one point, didn't take his empty eyes off it. The father didn't know that at that moment his son was trying somehow to signal him from the inside.
"Let's get you to bed, okay?"
Then he carried Martin in his arms to his room, put him on the bed, covered him with a blanket, and turned off the light. On that day, Martin felt a cold, ominous disappointment, but immediately thought that tomorrow would be a new day. He would definitely try again. And he tried for days, weeks, months, and nothing happened. He tried to moan, hoping that at least some sound would come out of his chest. He could devote a whole day to these attempts without stopping. He had a lot of time, but his body still didn't obey at all. Everything in his life was determined for him. Someone else decided for him what to wear, what to eat and drink, how and where to lie and sit, even where to look, what to watch and what to listen, and nothing could be done about it. No one perceived him as a person. In his presence, the nurses often discussed their problems, talked loudly on the phone about very personal things, chatted by themselves as if there was no one else in the room except them. Martin continued to try to move. The first thing he could feel for many years was his neck. He was finally able to move his head, although rather to twitch. His movement resembled convulsions. Martin could move his head, but he couldn't fully control this process and move smoothly. When he was able to move his head for the first time, he was incredibly happy, but no one even noticed. The fact is that his body was moving before that, but completely independently. It was like a spasm, and a leg or arm and head could suddenly fly into the air, so no one betrayed his first conscious movement of significance. All his movements were interpreted as reflexes of a primitive mind. Later, Martin was even able to focus his eyes and completely control his eyes. Again, the doctors explained this by what he does as any unreasonable creature. This doesn't mean any progress. Then, why no one tried to check whether Martin could give signals with his eyes is unknown, but the harsh reality hit him with all its might. An all-consuming fear came to Martin that he was locked in his body forever. The most painful thing was to hear from the mother that everything is useless, that all their efforts lead to nothing. The parents didn't see the changes. They were told for years that their son's brain was irreversibly damaged. They saw their son sitting in his armchair with twisted limbs, blurred eyes, and saliva flowing from his mouth, occasionally twitching his head awkwardly. They didn't know that their son was inside this body. Disappointment became immeasurable. Dark thoughts engulfed Martin. Now he thought every day about how terrible his fate was, and that it would only get worse. Over time, Martin completely stopped trying to react. He closed himself in his endless, obsessive, disgusting thoughts. His parents were busy all the time, taking care of Martin, caring for the other two kids, working. Everything was on autopilot. It isn't surprising that they didn't notice at all those small changes that nevertheless were in the behavior of their son. The next blow to the already unbearably hard life of Martin was the following. One night after his parents had a fight, the mother turned to her son and, not knowing that he heard everything, said,
"I wish you were just dead."
He thought then that he would go crazy with grief, and it was so painful for her to see what her son had become. At one point, she even tried to commit suicide. She lay down on the bed and, having previously taken a large handful of pills, closed her eyes and waited for death, and then got up, deciding to say goodbye to her relatives. Rodney immediately took his wife to the hospital, where her stomach was washed. Doctors after these events told Rodney that she should limit her presence near Martin for some time. She had hardly spent any time with her son before. Martin was looked after in the hospital. During the day and in the evenings, only his father took care of him. So the family was divided into two camps. David and Kim, together with their mother, avoided Martin. Joan suggested that her husband send her eldest son to a boarding school. She didn't believe that his condition could change. Rodney, on the other hand, said that his condition would definitely not change in the boarding school, but at home there was a chance. Martin was tormented by a sense of guilt due to the fact that his loved ones constantly swear, discussing his future fate. Martin's entire spectrum of emotions was painted in dark colors. The hospital was an unbearable place for Martin. It's scary to imagine what would have happened to him in a boarding school. People treated him very badly. He didn't feel a gram of human warmth from the workers. Someone did their duties clearly with icy professionalism. For some reason, Martin was no less afraid of such people. In the hospital, Martin was put in front of the TV, including the same thing every day. He hated the kids' show with Barney's purple dinosaur because he already knew every word.
What could be worse than this show?
Martin thought, but then the Teletubbies started. Martin's grave morale reached its breaking point. One day he realized that it couldn't get any worse and made a very important decision that helped change the situation in the other direction. He tried to think not in a negative way, as he had before. Now he tried to notice the good even in his hopeless situation. He completely changed the course of his thoughts. Martin quite consciously came to the conclusion that it was time to block black thoughts. It wasn't easy at first, but then it got easier. Day after day, Martin tried to find ways to keep himself busy. He liked to watch things change over time, how plants sprout new leaves, how the seasons come, how the wet floor dries, how the sunlight moves around the room. He left his fantasies and filled them only with bright colors. Perhaps because of this, in 2001, there was hope in a world of hopelessness for Martin. That hope's name was Verna Vanderwalt. She was the new nurse at the hospital. Verna was the only one who started talking to Martin every day, not with herself, not about him, not next to him, but with him. She talked to him about everything, about her seriously sick grandmother and her worries about it, and about her beloved puppy, whom she recently adopted. She seemed to be the only one who noticed any presence in Martin's body. One day, Verna accidentally saw a TV show about a woman who, after suffering a stroke, became numb, but despite this, she was able to communicate with people around her through a special technique. The girl didn't stop there. She went to an open day at the Medical Communications Center, where, by a happy coincidence, there were lectures on how to help people unable to speak for various reasons. She told Martin and the rest of the hospital staff about the information she received. They confidently stated that this wouldn't work with Martin. He couldn't speak because he had no consciousness, and not just problems with the vocal cords, or something else. There were other much more promising patients in the hospital, as it seemed to the workers, but for some reason Verna chose Martin. July 2001. It has been 13 years since Martin fell ill with an unknown disease. Rodney pushes the stroller with the Martin down the corridor of the Alternative Communication Center. The rest of the family follows them. Martin and his family were met by two doctors and taken to a small room. There they said that it's necessary to test the patient. It consisted in the fact that Martin was called an object, and he had to point to it with his eyes among the many pictures with different objects. They told him a ball, a flower, a TV set, and so on, and Martin tried to look at the place where the correct picture was located. Martin was afraid that all of a sudden, in fact, it only seemed to him that he was looking at the right point, while the rest didn't see anything. The tests continued. Now Martin had to point with his hand to the named word on the cards in front of him on the table, but when he tried to do this, his hand only shook. The thought was spinning in his head, causing panic.
I'll fail all tests.
There were many other tests, where, for example, Martin had to point to special characters with his head. At the end of all the tests, it was time to hear the verdict. Doctors said that Martin understands everything and can communicate, but they could hardly determine exactly how high his level of intelligence was. Most likely they believed that he was only able to signal his needs. However, after these tests, there were dramatic changes in the atmosphere of the family. Joan relented and began to take care of her son again. She began to cook more deliciously. The most favorite dish, spaghetti bolognese, made for Martin very often. When she watched TV, she asked Rodney to put her son next to her, laying his head on her lap. She was ashamed of the past, so asked Martin for forgiveness. Rodney talked to Martin all the time when he was at home, asked questions and waited for a reaction with his eyes or head. On the advice of doctors from the center, parents even made picture cards, and now Martin could greet them and even participate in simple dialogues, like a person who had just begun to learn a foreign language. Martin was capable of more. He understood it. But did others understand? Maybe not, but they definitely wanted to find out. The parents decided to buy Martin an electronic communication device that contained about 250 words and phrases. Martin was already eager to show his parents that he was capable of much. They had to understand that their son was very developed. Unfortunately, the South African currency has devalued, and now this expensive device has doubled in price. Joan and Rodney couldn't afford it, but there was a more economical way. They could order a special computer communications program. There were plenty of them, and his parents began to choose, ordering a variety of demos from around Europe. Rodney had read about them, studied them even at work, but Martin had to make the final decision. Father said to Martin,
Don't be afraid, son. This is just the beginning. It's certainly not a matter of life and death.
But it seemed to Martin that it was. Martin didn't miss his chance when the program was delivered. He and his parents spent many hours fully mastering it. Rodney told the truth. After mastering the first program, they moved on to the more difficult one until they reached high-tech speech synthesis devices for computer programs. Martin showed his extraordinary mental abilities. Now Martin has a voice. Verna was present in the life of the family. She convinced brother and sister Martin to communicate with him about everything and as often as possible. The brothers and sister became very close. When Martin received a tool for meaningful communication such as jokes, reasoning, discussions, and not just signals about primitive needs, he began to recover. Even his appearance began to change. He was transformed. It took a huge amount of work. His body became stronger and he began to regain fluidity and control over them. He soon got a job, went to college to study computer science, graduated with honors, got a dog he had long dreamed of, founded a web company, wrote a book, Ghost Boy, which was published in 2011. His body became stronger and he began to regain fluidity and control over them. He even learned to drive a specially equipped car, which he drives with his own hands. Unfortunately, control over his legs and voice hasn't yet returned to him. In 2008, Martin met his future wife Joanna. They first saw each other via Skype on New Year. She was a sister's friend. She recalls her first impression of Martin.
Initially, the first day when I saw Martin, I just thought, wow, he's so attractive. I loved his smile and his eyes, you know. But then later on, as I got to know him, I just found him to be such an honest and sincere man.
They got married in 2009 in the UK, where they're living nowadays. Soon they became parents of a son. The story of Martin Pistorius may seem like a fabrication, but it is now known that there is a locked-in syndrome or isolation syndrome. It manifests itself as paralysis with complete preservation of consciousness and sensitivity, often misdiagnosed as coma. This is a rare neurological disease that is being studied very actively now. These are not people with cerebral palsy or irreversible brain damage. This is different. Martin Pistorius always said,
"Treat everyone with kindness, dignity, compassion and respect whether or not you think they understand or not. To never underestimate the power of the mind, the importance of love and faith, and to never stop dreaming."